So I'm going to talk a little bit about how climate change impacts human health and talk about some of those health inequities that are associated with climate change and just environmental issues just in general. So one, thank you for allowing me to be here today. I really appreciate it. Let's see. I'm just going to kind of touch base, go over some of the broad topics about how climate change impacts human health. Then I'm going to just open it up for conversations and questions when Kevin and I have a Q&A afterwards. So, climate change is a significant threat to the health of the American people. And not just Americans, everybody around the world. But this statement came from a report that came out of the White House in 2016. And this report brought together experts throughout the federal government. We had everything from physicists all the way down to medical doctors and everybody in between, trying to understand how climate and climate change impacts human health. I was one of the authors on this report. I was one of the lead authors on this report. And so this report, when it came out, was basically trying to understand how climate change is impacting us here in the United States. And that was the first statement that came out of the report. The report's pretty long, but that was the first statement that came out of the report. The second statement that came out of that long report was, every American is vulnerable to the health impacts associated with climate change. And the reason that they could say that is when we looked at all the different ways that our climate system is changing and all the ways that it's impacting the United States, there wasn't a single person that we could say that wasn't going to be affected in some way. And we understand this because climate is already impacting our health. I'm sure many of you are already quite well aware of this. You know, everything from the direct impacts of our climate system around us. And so this is current. This is even without climate change, even though we are in a changed climate. The direct impacts, you know, when extreme heat events happen, when extreme weather events, changes in air quality that are associated with this. These are the things that send people to the hospital, make people sick. Then there's the indirect. This is the spreading of disease, disruption and destroying of food and water supplies, and then also just disruption of our well-being as well. And so the direct are those things that you see immediately, right? Those are like when you see, you know, I'm sure many of you saw the hurricane and the news reports of the hurricane hitting Florida. And you can see those immediate impacts. But whenever an event like that occurs, there's also the indirect or the delayed impact. So these are the things that manifest over weeks, months, or even potentially years. Those are much harder to see. But we understand that our climate system is changing, and it will continue to change in the future. We're seeing rising temperatures, more extreme weather events, rising sea levels, which we don't really have to worry quite as much about the rising sea level here in Nebraska. We're pretty landlocked for a benefit to us in that regard. But those changes are impacting the world around us, impacting our environment, and those changes in our environment then have impacts on our health. And so those are the pathways that we can potentially see. For example, you know, as more extreme weather events occur, you can see impacts on water quality, which then can lead to everything from harmful algal blooms, which we have here in Nebraska, to outbreaks of certain diseases. And so I said all populations are vulnerable, but there are certain things and certain factors out there, and in the medical realm, we call that social determinants of health. There are certain things that are out there that make certain populations more at risk than others. And this is the reason I put up this figure here. And so this figure is basically like the last figure you saw, that spinny wheel. Hopefully like energized everybody to watch like some spinny wheel as we're moving through this presentation, or maybe it just puts you to sleep. But the exciting part is that we understand a lot of those connections between changes in our climate system, how it impacts our environment, and those human health outcomes. And so that's that direct line that you see there. That's the change in our climate system up here, which then impacts the environment around us, which leads to human health outcomes. And there's a variety of human health outcomes. But I put this figure up because of these gray boxes on the outside. And those are incredibly important for understanding how, when our climate changes, as our climate changes, how that impacts us as individuals, how that impacts our community. And so the social and behavioral context and the environmental and institutional context. Social and behavioral, that is the individuals that live in the community around you. And so we're in Lincoln, that is the individuals that live in Lincoln. That is, what is the age, gender, race, ethnicity, the poverty situations that are occurring within your community, housing, infrastructure, education, discrimination that people face within their communities. These are the things that individuals experience on a regular basis. These are the things that, these are the actual people that live in your community. And then we have the environmental and institutional context. That is the area around us. That is our physical environment that we live in. And so, for example, that's if we go outside right now and we look around Lincoln, what is the infrastructure? How are the roads? What's our access to hospitals? Is there agriculture in the area? How are people treating the land? What is the environmental situations in the area? And so climate, one, impacts these things, these gray boxes, but these gray boxes also influence that pathway to human health outcomes. And so, for example, if, let's say a storm, a very severe storm, hits the middle of Nebraska and nobody lives out there, versus a severe storm hits here in Lincoln, what are the potential outcomes? What are the differences as far as the impacts on us if that storm hits here in Lincoln compared to the middle of nowhere? You can just throw something out there. Maybe you would see like people go in the hospital. Maybe people's houses would be potentially destroyed or disrupted in some way. Maybe their well-being would be destroyed or disrupted in some way. And so that's why we have to understand these gray boxes. We need to understand the people that live in our communities. We need to understand the challenges that they face. We also need to understand our actual infrastructure and the environment that we live in, and understand some of the challenges that are within our infrastructure. Because if we understand those things, that can help us understand the people that could potentially be affected when our climate changes, as our climate changes, and the next time we get hit by a severe weather or climate-related event. And so this is always my frustration. Sometimes when I'm having conversations, it's mostly with adults. The problem kind of came back to, well, there's nothing we can really do about it. And there's nothing that we can really try to do to address some of these issues. But my philosophy is we have to do things. We have to do things now because our environment is changing. Our climate has changed over the last 50 to 100 years. We're in a different climate than we were before. And so we need to make sure that we're building resilience, building a system that can't be disrupted by a changing climate. And that's how we protect lives. That's how we reduce the number of health impacts associated with these events. Because if we can't address the climate events that we're facing today and some of these issues, as far as social and behavioral, environmental, and institutional issues that we face, then we're not going to be able to protect people in the future as well. And so, I always say, how we prepare and respond influences our outcomes. And so if we're not preparing and responding to our changed climate that we live in, we're going to continue to see human health outcomes, and we're not going to be able to prepare and respond in the future. So I said all populations are vulnerable to the health impacts associated with climate change. Some populations, especially here in the United States, are more at risk than others. And here in the United States, it's typically communities of color, older adults, children, and low-income communities. There's a variety of different reasons for that. Everything from where they actually live, to things that they are being exposed to racism that they face and discrimination that they face, to pre-existing health conditions because of potentially even where they live or because of their age or other exposures that they encounter. So, as I mentioned, the impacts of climate change are now. We live in a changed climate. That changed climate is impacting us. It's impacting our health. It's impacting the health of our community. And that's a lot of the work that I try to do, is trying to understand how to understand these health impacts, understand which populations are most at risk, understand what are our vulnerabilities within our infrastructure, and how do we improve those things now so that we can help better address those in the future as well. Extreme heat's a great example of that. We've been seeing, and Martha and Deke have talked about this. Higher temperatures, more extreme heat events. These things have potential for human health impacts. It can lead to heat stroke, dehydration, heat-related illness, and a variety of other health impacts as well. At risk, outdoor workers, student athletes, people that are exposed to these conditions, people living without air conditioning, people with chronic diseases, pregnant women, older adults, and young children as well. And why is the heat such a big, important factor for our health? Heat likely kills more people than any other climate or weather-related disaster here in the United States. More people likely die because of extreme heat exposure. And this is my little advocacy here that I'm just trying to express to you. So take extreme heat serious. It likely kills more people in the United States than any other weather-related disaster. More than hurricanes and tornadoes. Heat. Any ideas why heat might have more impacts? I'll throw that out as a question to the... Go for it.
People are probably less familiar with...
Yeah, less familiar. Maybe they don't take it as serious as well. What about heat? Oh, go ahead. I see a hand. Skin cancer can be caused by exposure to sun, but that'd be over a longer period of time. What about more immediate? Oh, go ahead.
It is less clear what is dangerous, like a hurricane. Oh, I should get away. Oh, it's really hot outside. I'm not going to run away.
Right. Yeah, that's a perfect example. And then where do... Oh, go ahead.
Certain weathers, like weather, whereas everywhere experiences.
Boom. Yeah. Yeah. Hurricanes might happen once a year, maybe a couple times a year. Extreme heat events happen everywhere, multiple times a year, likely all across the United States. Each time one of those happens, there is a potential for a human health outcome. That's why we need to take it serious. That's why we need to understand. We also need to understand which populations are most at risk. Here in Nebraska, we definitely face some challenges. This is a project that we work on, looking at vulnerability associated with extreme heat. And so, how many are familiar with redlining? All right, most of you. And I'll just summarize it. There's a lot here. So historic redlining, these were practices that were put in place in the early 1900s. These practices were put in place to basically deem certain parts or certain locations less valuable, so they didn't want to put investment into these communities. And so it made it difficult for red-lined and yellow-lined areas, they're all red-lined, but certain areas to receive financial assistance, to receive loans, to receive a lot of these other things. And so they deemed certain communities better for some of this financial assistance, and they deemed some of these communities less acceptable for some of these financial programs and assistance and loans and bank assistance and all this other stuff. One of the factors that was put in place was based around discrimination. It was redlined areas in the United States were a lot of times areas, people of color, populations of color, and also ethnic minorities as well. And so those financial practices that were put in place in the early 1900s still have ramifications on our communities today. You can see the impact still today from some of that historical redlining. And we see it here. This is Douglas County, Omaha, and Omaha has issues with historical redlining. So the first part is where historical redlining. So you see the yellow and red places in Omaha. That was where the historical redlining and some of those financial issues occurred. You look forward in time, we did a study looking at heat vulnerability, and we tried to identify which populations are most vulnerable or most at risk to extreme heat exposure. And one of the things that you'll notice is we see higher risk in that northeast part of Douglas County in Omaha, which also fits into where some of that historical redlining occurred. And why does that matter? Well, it kind of goes back to those health impacts. This was from a couple years ago. There was a major heat wave that hit Douglas County, hit Omaha, hit Nebraska. That heat wave led to at least 30 hospitalizations associated with that heat wave. And just at CHI, the hospital in Omaha, the med center where I'm at, I think saw somewhere between 10 to 20 hospitalizations just associated with that heat wave. So these things have impacts on our community, and unfortunately certain people within our community are more at risk because of some of these historical practices. That's work that we're trying to do. We're trying to understand which populations are more at risk and understanding how some of this heat exposure happens across our community, especially in Omaha. This is a study that we're doing looking at urban heat island. And so one of the things that we know as you go into metro areas, the temperatures get warmer. There's more concrete, there's more asphalt. There's less green space. That increases the temperature. You can see up to 10 degrees difference in temperature in the interior of metro areas versus the exterior of metro areas. And so we had a urban heat island campaign where we went around and we drove around and identified changes in temperature and using that information to get that back to our communities to understand what are some of the threats that we face within our communities associated with extreme heat. Extreme weather has impacts as well. We've been seeing a change in frequency and intensity of this, which then can lead to injury, displacement, and death. We've been seeing more of these expensive billion-dollar climate and weather-related disasters over time. So we've been seeing more of these types of events hitting, and we're definitely familiar with these events here in Nebraska. This was in 2019. We had major flooding throughout Nebraska. This flooding led to hundreds of people being displaced, especially in rural areas. There were at least 3 reported deaths, 2 hospitals sustained damage, dozen long-term care facilities. These are like nursing homes, homes for the elderly, were evacuated during that time. And then we saw access to care issues, especially in rural areas, that lasted for months afterwards. What was a 2-hour drive to Omaha, which is where we have our major medical facility here in Nebraska, may have turned into a 3 or 5-hour drive. There's a number of other impacts as well. We also see that certain populations with changes in our climate system are exposed to certain contaminants, some even naturally occurring contaminants. And so there was a major study that was looking at arsenic. Did you know that we have naturally occurring arsenic in Nebraska, in the groundwater, in certain locations? And what they found was that during drought events, they actually see more people that are especially on private wells. These are people that have their own drinking water system, live out in the very rural and remote areas. They're more exposed to arsenic during drought events. These are just some of the potential linkages. And then mental and behavioral health impacts as well, especially of extreme weather events. We've done some work around this and shown that especially farmers associated with drought, you can see an increased reported levels of stress in farmers during drought events. This is problematic because farm workers and agricultural workers have one of the higher suicide rates of any occupation out there. And there's also less access to care, especially when we're talking about mental and behavioral health in rural areas as well. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do. We can work on education, we can work on outreach, we can work on engagement. There are things that we can do to better prepare our communities and understand these potential impacts and reduce the threats that we face. And that's some of the work that we're doing. We work within the Water, Climate, and Health program, and we're also working with students and medical students to try to get them more involved and engaged around some of these efforts. Because we need to make sure that we have the next generation of people that are working on making sure that we have a more secure and better environment that we live in. And so we have medical students that are working with us. We have public health students. We have young people, because that's where we really need to focus, as most of you already know. Because we can do things to make sure that we're preparing and building our communities stronger, understanding the threats that we face, and reducing the potential impacts, especially the health impacts that we face as well. And there's a number of different ways that we can do that, and I'd be happy to talk about it. And so with that, I will hand it over to Kevin. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. Is this on? Okay. Haumadakiapi, Chawashtea nape chuza pielo, Tachanku heska macha pielo, Malakota. Hello, relatives. I've greeted you as relatives in my traditional Lakota language. In my people's belief system, we believe that we are all related. And so I always like to give this traditional introduction. My Indian name is Holy Road, and my non-native name is Kevin Abourezk. And I serve as a managing editor for Indians.com. It's a Native American news website. Before this, I spent 18 years as a reporter and editor for the Lincoln Journal-Star here in Lincoln. I serve on the board for the Lincoln Indian Center and in a number of other volunteer capacities here in Lincoln. I want to start first just by thanking Dr. Bell for his really incredible presentation. It hopefully leads somewhat well into what I'm going to be talking about today. And I don't have a presentation today. I'm just going to talk to you. And what I'm going to talk to you about is something called environmental justice or environmental discrimination. I'd ask one of you, first of all, just how would you define environmental justice? Yes.
Kind of the inequalities and who cause climate change and who feel the effects of climate change, those discrepancies in the populations and in the work.
Great, yeah. Just a description of the inequalities of the people who cause climate change versus the people who are affected by it. I thought I saw a hand here. Would you like to add anything?
I think it's finding solutions for minorities that are being affected the most. That's
Sure.
how I
Great. Yeah, and I'm going to talk from my perspective. My perspective, obviously, is I'm Native American. I'm enrolled in the Rosebud Sioux tribe. And so, and as a journalist, I've covered these issues for a number of years, just looking at the impacts of environmental change, climate change on Native communities especially. I can tell you that Native communities have been suffering from environmental injustice for decades, if not centuries. And I would say the first act of environmental injustice enacted upon Native people was just moving them off of some of the most fertile grounds in this country, where they were able to, hunt and gather, take care of themselves, and putting them in places in this country where they were unable to take care of themselves. And this was a very determined, how would you put this, intentional effort by our federal government to do this. And the main reason was, of course, to clear these lands, these fertile lands, so that settlers, moving west could take these lands and farm and do what they wanted with them. So we saw this happen across the country. And one of the questions I always like to ask a group like this is, do you know the Native people that used to live in the place you now call home? And I'll just start with Lincoln here. Does anybody know any of the tribes that used to call Lincoln and Lancaster County home? Yes? It's close. They were mostly in actually Wisconsin, and they were part of the Ho-Chunk Nation. They were moved in later years, though, to obviously northeast Nebraska now, but started out in Wisconsin. Thank you. Anybody else? Oto? Yes, thank you. Appreciate that. So the four tribes that are considered to be the four tribes that consider Nebraska their ancestral homelands are the Oto-Missouri, the Kansa, the the Pawnee, and the Omaha tribe. They're the ones that consider Lincoln and Lancaster County their homelands. And this is the result of some study by a number of historians, including, I'll add, David Wishart, a UNL historian who studied the dispossession of Native peoples here in Nebraska. And he identified these 4 tribes as the ones that called this area home. So one of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to welcome some of these people home. That's part of our effort to try to address some of these historical wrongs that were enacted upon Native people. Today, the Oto-Missouri primarily live in Oklahoma. The Pawnee also live in Oklahoma. The Omaha or Omaha people, they live in northeast Nebraska, so they were kind of moved off into that corner. And the Kansas peoples mostly are in Kansas and some in Oklahoma as well. So I'm part of an effort that's trying to bring some of them home. And I'm working with the UNL historian, Margaret Jacobs, who the 2 of us have been really trying to welcome the Oto-Missouri back home. We actually welcomed about 50 of them back to Lincoln a little over a week ago now, maybe about 2 weeks ago now. And this was the first time that this large of a delegation of Oto-Missouri people had returned to Lincoln, their ancestral homelands, in over 170 years. You can imagine that's a long time to be away from the lands that your great-great-grandparents once knew so well. And it was really emotional for them to come back home and walk the lands, near the rivers and along the hills where their ancestors lived. It was a really profound experience for them. So that's just one way that we're trying to address this issue of environmental injustice that I would say that was enacted upon them by moving them from these very fertile grounds here in Lincoln and Lancaster County to Oklahoma, or what was Indian Territory at the time. I wanted to talk some as well about just some of the other things that have happened to tribes in America in terms of environmental injustice. 2 of the largest nuclear toxic waste facilities were built upon indigenous lands in America. One of them was Yucca Mountain, which was built in Nevada upon the Shoshone lands. And the other one was, boy, I'm going to mess this up. I apologize. I had it on my phone. I think it's called Benton. This is something I hadn't heard about until I did some research. But Hanford nuclear site in the state of Washington. And this was built on the Yakima Nation tribal homelands. Tribes are easy targets in this sense. And it's easy for federal government officials and others to put things like nuclear waste facilities on tribal lands. Native people for many, many generations now haven't had a political voice. We don't have political leaders in Washington for the most part. That's changing a little bit now with people like Deb Haaland and some of the other people who've joined Congress and Ben Nighthorse Campbell, who was the one United States Senator who was Native American. He's no longer serving, but it's changing a little bit, but not so much that Native people have any sort of powerful voice in this country. And when you don't have a political voice, you become an easy target for acts of environmental justice, injustice rather. It's easy to place these kinds of things on your lands if you have no way to fight it. So we also see things like pipelines so often are built across native lands, or they're built across treaty lands of tribes. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Standing Rock protest up in North Dakota that occurred in 2016 and 2017. But this protest was an effort to try to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline. Now this is about a nearly 1,200-mile pipeline that travels from North Dakota, the shale oil fields of North Dakota, down to southern Illinois. And this crossed the territories of the Standing Rock Reservation, the Standing Rock Sioux people of South Dakota and North Dakota. So as a result of this, a number of tribal people, tribal leaders and non-native people who are allies to them, held a protest over the course of a little more than a year in a place called Standing Rock. And you probably saw some news reports of this, but it was one of the largest political acts of activism in Native history in decades, if not centuries. You had tens of thousands of people coming to this place to try to fight the development of this pipeline. Unfortunately, it didn't work. They were able to continue to move forward with the pipeline, and it was completed in 2017, and I think its first oil was probably delivered in about 2018, and it continues to this day, unfortunately. But these kinds of things, they're very concerning to Native people for a lot of reasons, one of which is oil spills. Just, one of the areas that this pipeline crosses is under the Oahe Dam there. And this is along the Missouri River. And the fear there is that if this pipeline bursts, which pipelines are prone to do, it's going to contaminate the water source of the Standing Rock Sioux people and everybody, downriver from that pipeline burst. So that's the fear, and and it's a very real fear, and it's something that Native people are trying to prevent from happening. Another protest that's been taking place is one in Minnesota against Line 3, and this is another pipeline that would cross a lot of the Anishinaabe and Ojibwe lands there in Minnesota. And one of the things it would do is it would cross through a lot of the wetlands, a lot of the lakes and some of the rivers that the Anishinaabe people use to collect their rice. Collecting rice is something that the Anishinaabe people have been doing for generations, and it's very important to their culture, to their economies. A lot of people, that's how they make their money. They go out in these little boats, and typically there'll be two of them on the boat, and they'll get a little stick, and one of them will kind of steer the boat, and the other one, as they go through these rice areas on these lakes, they'll tap the rice sort of stalks, and the rice will fall into the canoes, and they describe it as, it sort of sounds like rain hitting a tin ceiling or something like that, and it's a really beautiful thing, this practice that they have of collecting rice. And there's a real danger that they won't be able to do this anymore. If they build this pipeline through these wetlands, through these lakes, and especially if those pipelines burst, the great fear is that they're going to lose this ability to provide for themselves. And there again, if that happens, that's an incredible act of environmental injustice upon Native people of this country. There have been a lot of efforts to really protect Native lands, to protect our abilities to provide for ourselves. And Native people, I would say, are very poised to do this. When we look out at a lake and we look out at a hill or something like that, we don't see dollar signs for the most part. Some of us do, don't get me wrong. We have economic people in our communities as well, developers and things like that. But for the most part, our view is that these are natural resources that we've inherited from our ancestors, and that we're borrowing from our grandchildren, and that we want to protect these resources for, we say, 7 generations. Everything we try to do is looking into the future to ensure that in 7 generations, these resources will be there for our children, for our grandchildren. Native people have been preserving these lands, have been stewards of these lands for generations, for centuries, and we understand how to take care of these lands. But that knowledge just isn't being received or accepted. It's being ignored for the most part. And it's something that is really hurting our natural resources in America, especially our forests, I would say. Native people have long understood that fire was an important way of trying to prevent larger forest fires. Having these smaller controlled burns within forests was one way that we were able to ensure that there wasn't this constant development of undergrowth and dead trees and dead plants and things like that that would lead to these massive forest fires that we're seeing today, especially in the West, California, and places like that. But Native people understood that fire was an important tool in this effort. They also understood that fire was an important tool in preserving prairies. Without the use of fire, oftentimes prairies become forests. That's kind of their natural progression. But Native people, after watching for so many years the slow growth of these forests into these prairie areas, understood that burning those prairies was a way to prevent that growth of the forest. But it was also a way to just preserve the health of the prairie itself. We would see, after especially like lightning strikes that would cause these prairie burns, we would see that after the prairie was burned, the plants would come back better than ever, stronger than ever. And we would see things like buffalo come into these areas, and they would prefer these areas that were burned because of the growth of this fresh vegetation. So they understood the importance of these kinds of tools in maintaining our natural environment. So it's important, I think, that Native people become part of this conversation and that we become, players essentially in trying to preserve this world, preserve this environment for future generations. So I wanted to say that much, but I did want to just talk a little bit shortly before we start our Q&A here, just about some work that's being done to try to preserve our natural environments. One of the organizations I would direct you to is called Honor the Earth. This is an organization based in Minnesota, and it's run by a woman named Winona LeDuc, who's a very respected member of the Native environmental community. She's an Ojibwe woman who lives in Minnesota. And she's been working for a long time to stop things like Line 3, the Dakota Access Pipeline, and just to really elevate the conversation when it comes to understanding of Native ways of trying to revitalize our Indigenous foods and our Indigenous practices when it comes to protection of our natural environment through fire or through just kind of rebuilding our natural environment in many different ways. So I would direct you to Honor the Earth. It's a really incredible organization. They're doing some really incredible work in various communities. And they're doing a lot of education. They're just kind of a big part of this effort to educate people about different ways that Native people should be part of these conversations. So I did want to talk something just shortly about an effort here locally that I'm part of. I don't know if any of you have heard of the Nisquithe Prayer Camp, but this is an effort that I was part of that began back in April. And one of the things that Native people struggle with is to protect their sacred places in America. Oftentimes, when it comes to protection of Native sacred places, we're just kind of forgotten, just kind of neglected. And our sacred places just aren't deemed that important. One of the most sacred places in America for my people, the Lakota people, is the Black Hills of South Dakota. And if you've ever been to the Black Hills of South Dakota today, you'll see that there's not a whole lot of effort to protect what we consider our most sacred place. Here in Lincoln, Nebraska, we practice something called the Inipi ceremony, or the sweat lodge. And this is one of our most sacred rites. We have about 3 Inipi lodges here in Lincoln, in Lancaster County. And one of them is near 1st and Pioneer Street. And earlier this year, back in April, there was a development proposed here called Wilderness Crossing. Wilderness Crossing would be a fairly massive, like a 575-unit housing and retail development built on about 80 acres near 1st and Pioneers. And this is something that would be built right next door to our largest green space here in Lincoln, Wilderness Park. And it would also be built right next door to our oldest and most used Inipi Lodge. That's a place called the Fish Farm, kind of a funny name, I know. But it's something that we feel is going to be incredibly detrimental, if not outright destructive, to that sweat lodge. Our Inipi lodges, they require a great deal of quiet, essentially. This isn't a church where you can kind of build those wherever you want because they tend to be kind of protected from whatever's outside of them. Inipi lodges are essentially just a hut with, covered with canvas. And we have a pit in the center that we fill with hot rocks. And we get inside of this hut and we close the door and it's just completely dark on the inside of it. And we pray. And we pour water over the rocks. It's sort of like a sauna. That heat hits you, and it's incredibly, incredibly hot. And we pray and we sing. But this ceremony requires a great deal of quiet. And putting 575 housing units, 1,200 cars every day, right outside the door, essentially, of our sweat lodge is just going to ruin the serenity and sanctity of that place for us. So it's something that we're trying to stop, or at least require that there be some sort of accommodation given to our Inipi Lodge. So we set up teepees actually on that land after this development was proposed and after the city council approved the zoning change for that property. We set up 7 teepees on the land there for 16 days. We weren't invited. This is something that we did under the cover of darkness, and we stayed there for 16 days. We eventually did leave. We decided that we wanted to take the effort, the fight essentially to stop this project from ruining our Inepi and ruining Wilderness Park as well. We needed to take it to the next step. And right now we're in conflict with the city. We're trying to reverse the zoning change that allowed this project to happen. And so we've filed an administrative appeal before the Lincoln Board of Zoning Appeals to stop this project from moving forward. And there's a good chance this will be taken to the courts. In fact, the city has already taken it to the courts to try to stop us from doing what we're doing. So this is a local effort, to protect Wilderness Park, to protect this Inepi Lodge, to ensure that our sacred places are protected, but also that our important, vital green spaces are protected in our community. We should be in our communities, we should be talking about expanding green spaces. We should be talking about protecting sacred places. We should be talking about trying to preserve what we have in terms of our natural resources for our future generations, rather than trying to squeeze every little bit of economic benefit we can from these things. We need to start thinking about how to use these natural resources that we still have, for the betterment of our communities. So with that, I'm gonna end, and we can start our Q&A if we'd like. So thank you.
Hi. I don't want a simple fix with this, but often when these sorts of issues come up, people start to glaze over when you dive into long histories and systematic and systemic oppression and barriers that have been set up that result in these disproportionate outcomes. What's a clean way that you've found to maybe break down some of those barriers when talking to people about these issues? Thank you.
Sure. I'm not sure if I have all the right answers. Good. It is difficult. And one of the things that I think is most important, and this is from my perspective as somebody that works on these issues, you have to develop a continuous relationship with the communities. Like, you just can't come in and be like, oh, I'm going to save you. This is great. Look what we can do. And you really have to show that you're going to be there for the long haul, and building up some of those relationships, building up capacity, and making sure that you're going to continue working on these efforts. Because as we've kind of talked about, many of these issues have been established for decades, generations. And so trying to break those down, trying to address those issues are incredibly complex. And there's not really always a simple solution to address those. But I would say, for me, from my perspective, one of the first things that I try to do is establish that, we're here. We're going to be a part of this. This isn't just for the next 5 years or the next 3 years or whatever it is, but we want to try to continue to work on these issues. And that's where we really need to build relationships within communities, because coming in as an outsider into a community isn't going to be beneficial for the long run. I don't know, Kevin, did you have?
Yeah, well, I would just add that whenever I talk to people about why these kinds of issues are important to address, I try to talk about the impact of not doing anything on our children and our grandchildren. We all have loved ones. We all have people we care about and who we want to protect and who we want to care for. So coming at it from that point of view as a parent, essentially, or somebody who cares about his people, and trying to start with that, let's see what we can do for our children. Let's see what we can do for our grandchildren. To me, that's a great way to start these conversations.
I agree.
There's a question from online, kind of similar to, I guess, what you were just saying. How do you suggest we start the conversation of preserving our local natural resources, and how have you started the conversation?
One of the things that we try to do, especially at the Lincoln Indian Center, is try to model this kind of behavior. We're actually in the process of building a greenhouse at the Indian Center, and it's one of the things we want to do in order to model, how this can be done. And this greenhouse that we're going to be building is going to be built with used tires, essentially, that will form the structure, the wall of the greenhouse. And it's made with other kinds of recycled material. And we want to put it kind of in the front of our building so that when people drive by, they'll be able to see it. So that's just one way, is essentially just kind of modeling that behavior. And doing things like, hosting meals that are a little more health conscious, and we use local foods a lot in our meals. We still do the Indian tacos. I don't know if you ever had an Indian taco. It is not made from, good materials or anything like that, but they sure taste good. But we do, attempt to serve more natural kinds of meals and that sort of thing when we can. So.
And I can even add a little bit, and just from the example, for example, we're looking at the impacts of urban heat island in Omaha, and looking at how certain communities are being more exposed to extreme heat events. One of the ways that you combat against that is green space, and by green space I mean trees, parks, things like that, and taking abandoned lots and actually turning that into a park. And that's complicated, but it's also very important because, one, that's an educational opportunity as well for people to understand and have more connection with the environment that they live in. But also it has that ability to reduce exposure to extreme heat, especially in the places that are more exposed. And it also can provide better air quality, which we also have issues with that. I could talk with that for like an hour, just about Omaha in itself. But the way that we're addressing that is working with, one, community partners, and making them understand and helping them become more aware of some of the issues that we're facing within Omaha. And then we're also working with the decision makers within the community and helping them identify that there are certain places that are more at risk to extreme heat, and that we need to make more effort in some of those communities to have more green space and do things that are potentially reducing extreme heat exposure in those areas as well.
We'll give people here a chance for the next question.
Thank you. How do you react to, for example, what's going on in the world or even in Omaha when, things are headed towards clean energy, and then the war comes along and now people are going to be burning more coal? In North Omaha, for example, OPPD was going to shut a coal-fired power plant, and now they say we got to keep it open for 2 more years. How should we react to that?
That's hard. And I can tell you about some of the work that we've done. And so when we talk, and I talked briefly about air quality, we recently did some work and identified that certain areas of Omaha, one, are more exposed to poor air quality. Two, and those areas are usually low income and communities of color, have the worst air quality in Omaha. Two, they have the highest rates of pediatric asthma hospitalizations in the state, are in those locations as well. And three, the other factor that we realized is at certain times of year that asthma-related hospitalizations, children's asthma-related hospitalizations in Omaha are actually very closely tied with our pollen issues that we face. And we've been seeing an increase in ragweed pollen season in Nebraska. Anytime that happens, it can potentially lead to something like a asthma-related hospitalization. And so we presented that to the Omaha Public Power District, so at least that they understood if they're going to continue to putting in this or allowing this coal-fired power plant to to take place. And just for all of you to know, there's a coal-fired power plant that's located in North Omaha, and it's probably contributing to some of the poor air quality issues that we're seeing in that region. So one of the things that we did was present those results and present some of that information to OPPD, so at least they can be aware that continuation of this is going to mean that our most vulnerable, most at-risk population will be continued to be exposed to some of these pollutants in the future as well. So I think that's the first factor, but it's a complicated one. I wish I had the answer for it. Okay.
I would just add one thing, that the U.S. military, and I know this is a strange time to bring this up with all of the military posturing going on in our world today, and the very real conflict in the Ukraine. But I do need to add that the U.S. military is the largest polluter in the world and the largest user of both fossil fuels and renewable energy. If we were to cut some of this wasteful military spending, we could actually deploy our military here in our own country to fight things like climate change and, firefighting, flood and disaster prevention, these kinds of things. So I did feel the need to mention that.
Thank you both for your presentations. Kevin, I think this is more for you. So I teach world religions in a Catholic high school and Catholic social teaching, and some of the stuff I try to address is how to understand places as sacred, and that we've kind of lost that sense of what sacred means and whose place is worthy to be called sacred, and save that. So I guess I'm just more curious to hear from you, how do you present what is sacred, and how people who are not in your footsteps and with the traditions that the Indigenous natives have, to understand that sacred and appreciate that it's not just a church building, which is sacred to, a lot of us in here, but that it's land and that you can't just replace that.
Well, thank you. Beautiful question. And it's a tough one. It's a very tough issue. We're talking about cultural differences. We're talking about everything that makes a person who they are. Your experience, where you were raised, how you were raised, the kind of resources you had growing up or didn't have. And also understanding the history of this place, And I'm not just talking the last 50 years or even 100 years, but 500 years. Really trying to understand, what is this place that we call home, Lincoln, Lancaster County? At one time, this was a place where people like the Oto-Missouri, Pawnee, Kansas, Omaha peoples, where they lived, where they hunted and gathered, where they buried their loved ones. The Omaha people called this place Niskithe. That's why we called our prayer camp Niskithe. It means salt water. And it was named because this is where a lot of tribes would come to gather their salt here along Salt Creek. There used to be huge deposits of salt there. There would even be pillars of salt that you could come and see and collect salt from. They would take it back to their communities, and they would use it to cure their buffalo meat or other kinds of foods. But imagine, if this was the only place you could come to get salt, or if this is a place where you had buried, your father or your grandfather, your grandmother, your aunt, what would that mean to you? What do your cemeteries mean to you, where your people are buried? What does that mean to you? What are the places that you enjoy visiting, the lakes and other places that you love visiting so much? What does that mean to you? What if somebody came along and said, that's not important? We're going to build over that. We're going to construct something on top of that. How would you feel about that? That's the best way I can try to get people to understand what our sacred places mean to us. And they aren't just churches. They aren't even just inipi lodges. They're the rivers or the hills, these places that we've deemed important to us for whatever reason. So thank you.
Time that we have for questions. So thank you to both Kevin and Jesse. Let's give them another round of applause.
Good job. Thank you.